Ajit, thank you so much for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Arme.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot to get into today, and how you created the YouTube channel Synopsis, and how you're breaking down movies, connecting it to popular culture and thinkers like Nietzsche, like Jung, like Sigmund Freud and all that. But before we get into all that, I want to learn more about your backstory and your background. So tell me, is movies something you've always been interested in, like as a kid, or was this something that was brought onto your interest fairly recently, or how was it for you?
Yeah, movies have always been a big interest of mine. I can vividly remember watching Prisoners of Azkaban, the Harry Potter movie.
Yeah, yeah.
I
The
was like,
third one, I think, right?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and I was like 8 years old. That was the first movie I saw in theaters. And the fact that I have such a vivid memory of it, I think speaks to the idea that movies have always sort of had this impact on me from a young age. Even before I sort of took an interest in like other aspects of like art and whatnot, movies were sort of the original focus point that has been consistent my whole life. Yeah.
And then I see. So I understand we were talking a little bit earlier before, when you went to high school and went to college and you studied statistics. What made you go down that path rather than, going down the path of maybe studying cinematography or something like that?
Yeah. I sort of had, I think, the parents' influence plus a little bit more of like a pragmatic voice in my head, suggesting that to maybe pursue something such as like art in movies or whatnot, a college degree isn't necessarily all that sort of vital, because that's a sort of interest I can explore on my own. Whereas my kind of going into statistics as a degree choice was more just pragmatic in terms of it offers me a stable outlook on the future that can provide a safety net, which will allow me to really go head deep into exploring my interests in movies without the fear that everything's going to fall apart. There's two sides to that thinking. Some people say don't give yourself a plan B and just go all in on it. I am just more comfortable with the notion that I do have a safety net, so then I can really reach for the stars in terms of interests in movies and whatnot, and kind of give it my all that way.
I honestly would definitely agree with having that safety net. I think far too much it's pushed in culture. You see, it's like, no, you can't have a plan B.
Yeah.
You need to put all your eggs in one basket. Well, that's not really people that succeed in that right. That's good, but there are very few exceptions. So it is a good idea to always have like a backup plan. So I definitely agree with it. I was actually watching a interview with Christopher Nolan. I know
Nice.
you really like him, and his dad said he told his dad, I want to, go make movies. I don't need to go to college. And his dad said, no, go to college, study something, and then you could try to make movies on the side or do it later, but have a base. So that's actually how he went and studied English, and then he started making his movies. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think if one of the biggest directors ever could have that type of thinking and succeed, we could too.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So you're going to university in Texas at Rice University. You studied statistics, and then you decided to come out here in LA because there was a music school that you want to come to here and learn more about music. So tell me more about that transition and how that, how that evolved into making this YouTube channel.
Yeah. So music sort of took over as my main priority in life when I was like 14 years old.
Right.
I was always a musical kid because my parents made me learn the piano and violin and pushed me into orchestra when I was young. I was never interested in all that.
Like school orchestra?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And just classical music I can appreciate now, but back then, like, I really did not enjoy playing like Beethoven on the violin over
Right.
and over again. But I took an interest in like playing the guitar when I was 14.
I actually did too.
Yeah, you did?
Yeah.
Yeah. It really consumes you when you
Yeah.
get into it. And for me, it was like this just never ending interest in what spiraled into the guitar and then into just like generally making music. And then just like got entranced in that whole world of like music production. So that was always sort of in the back of my mind of I'm going to a 4-year college to study statistics so I can appease my parents and also just appease my own sense of stability for the future. But the plan was always after I graduate, take a gap year to go to Los Angeles for a year and just study sort of audio engineering.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's what I did. So it was right after COVID, or it was actually during the midst of COVID. And that gave me like kind of a good excuse to try it out because I told my parents, listen, like I graduated in 2020, right when COVID started. So I told them, look, there's sort of this weird nebulous hiring freeze upon the world for a year.
Right. Yeah.
Let me take this time to explore what I've always intended on doing. It makes perfect sense now, timing wise. So I came out here and kind of went through that program. And I had the intention of sort of working with the specific producer that I've kind of been very inspired by. His name is Kashmir.
Yeah.
And it just so
EDM, right?
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. He's probably like my biggest inspiration, and he had some connection to the school, so I kind of got involved with him in that way. And then that kind of spiraled into me just having sort of like a job within the music world directly after that 1 year gap year. So that's what landed me out here in LA, sort of working within the music world after studying statistics for 4 years.
Tell me what you did in the music world when you came out here. So you went to school, and then what happened?
So while I was at school, I got connected with him, and he was working on a sort of like a big project, and it just involved sort of kind of collecting together a few music producers to help him on this big project of his. And so I sort of just like forced myself into that circle. I kept asking like, hey, can I be a part of this? Can I be a part of this? And he's like, credit on him. It was just like, yeah, sure, I'll give this kid a shot.
Right.
So I kind of got on board working on that project. And then after I graduated, I got a job within his label. So I was sort of doing this thing where I was working sort of a little bit on the music side of things, helping him with this project, and also working on the business side with his label. And so that was sort of the outlook for life in LA for like 6 months after I graduated from that school.
Perfect. And then I think shortly after you started working at a Sony, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah. So that kind of having a little bit of experience within the music industry helped a lot because then I got connected with some folks at Sony Music and just kind of went through the hiring process, talking to some folks. And it seemed like my background, both with music and studying statistics and data science, seemed to really be a promising prospect for the folks at Sony. So then I started working at Sony.
I love it. You're kind of, getting two things, then you're marrying it into what you're doing at Sony. So
Yeah.
it's a great way to go about your job. I like that.
Yeah.
So I've checked out your channel. I've watched your videos. I think it's very interesting what you do at Synopsis because believe me, I really like movies, and I've watched a lot of people sit down, break down movies, reveal what they think about it, what spoiler alerts, reviewing movies. But the approach that you take, not just you and your partner take, is you take the movie and not only do you break it down to your own analysis, you tie it down to how it relates to culture and just different philosophy throughout life, and you relate it to different psychological theories, and you're kind of just blending psychology, philosophy, culture, and movies all into one state. What do you think gave you that insight to understand that? Take a movie like, American Psycho and tie that into Sigmund Freud or tie that into Friedrich Nietzsche. What do you think lets you take movies and philosophy and tie those concepts together? Because to be honest with you, a lot of people would watch a movie and just find the value in the movie and maybe just a little bit of deep thought about it, but they don't go so deep into it. What do you think accesses you? What do you think gets access in your brain when you want to analyze those movies.
I've always been interested in culture,
Yeah.
both on sort of independently how cultural artifacts, symbols influence the way I look at the world, but also just on a macro level, how does culture morph throughout generations? How does it affect just generally a consensus wide world view? So, with that said, I've found that having a view of movies in the sense of how they can individually sort of impact culture and different subcultural movements, it's always just something I've been tapped into. When I said that I had like an early interest in movies, I was particularly interested in movies that inspired me on like a individual character level in terms of like shaped how I acted a little bit.
Right.
And also just generally movies that spurred a movement, like a strong movement in a sense. So like a good example is maybe like, The Hunger Games. I think The Hunger Games was an interesting movie because Jennifer Lawrence's character, I'm forgetting her name at the time, but whoever Jennifer Lawrence played,
Yeah. I don't remember either, but yeah.
yeah, whatever her name was.
Yeah.
It was interesting because you're sort of seeing a female protagonist who's sort of like this badass, and she's this bow hunting woman who that sort of shaped a little bit like a cultural identity for a lot of different women. They didn't see a protagonist like a female protagonist portrayed in that light. And I remember vividly just like being in high school at the time when that movie came out, sort of thinking, wow, okay, this movie seems to have generated some type of macro level cultural movement. So with that said, when I looked at the movies like American Psycho and like Fight Club for the Synopsis channel, which were the first two movies that we analyzed, I was interested in breaking down why is it that these movies have made such a cultural impact, both for people on an individual level and also just generally a macro level cultural impact. So American Psycho has really made like a big cultural impact for individuals who particularly you see for like lonely men who are a little bit, they feel like they're on sort of a fringe of mainstream society or Western society.
Sure.
They look to Patrick Bateman as this mirror image almost of themselves. And then like on a macro level, you see so many different memes about American Psycho and Patrick Bateman. You see so many people on like Halloween that just happened dress up as Patrick Bateman. It seems like this movie has generated some both individual level and just sort of like a consensus level cultural movement. And so when it comes to understanding that, that's when you look to people like Freud or Jung, who are the founders of modern day psychoanalysis. Their works have all been derived at understanding the deeper nuances of individual and sort of like consensus level psychology, but also in pointing out idiosyncratic behavior that we exhibit, which is why like people will feel so like drawn by Patrick Bateman, who's this serial killing murderer.
Wall Street, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So what? That movie came out decades ago.
Yeah.
Why do you think there's a revival of that movie right now?
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot because, for one, you don't see movies like that made anymore.
No, you really don't.
Yeah,
No.
and there's I believe there's a documentary on this, but just generally, this topic is something that has kind of been talked about in the year 1999, and then in the year 2000 as well. That sort of like 2-year span. You saw Fight Club, The Matrix, American Psycho, Eyes Wide Shut. These like amazing movies that all are sort of like still culturally relevant today.
Sure.
They all came out in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
So I think the reason why they have stood the test of time is, for one, they talk about evergreen subjects, which is, I think in the case of like American Psycho particularly, it talks a lot about sort of like individual emotions like envy, jealousy, and it talks about the sort of pressures of conformity for an individual to conform to the standards set by the people around him.
Sure.
These topics are evergreen. Regardless of what year we live in, those human dynamics never go away. And I think the way that it was so brilliantly portrayed in American Psycho, but also just generally in these movies that came out between 1999 and 2000. We don't see that happen anymore. We don't see movies touch on these subjects in such an artistic way anymore.
Why do you think that is though?
So for one, I actually heard Edward Norton, who's the actor who's the main the lead in Fight Club. He's talked about this. He mentioned how there was this sort of, in a sense, glitch in the matrix in 1999 and 2000, where the Hollywood studios just didn't really exercise as much control over the movie industry.
Sure.
And you saw these sort of auteur directors who sort of just kind of on their own volition created their own sort of story and were free to explore. They kind of spearheaded this form of storytelling that really spoke, I think, to people in a very direct manner. Nowadays, I think what you're seeing is a lot more exercise of control by the studios, and just generally a lot more of the movie industry being like a profiteering machine, which is why like most movies now are either a superhero movie or some horror movie, because those two genres of movies, they are gonna sell well and they're gonna generate audience views. People are just naturally interested in horror movies because they bring about some sense of fear, which is a very strong emotion, and then superhero movies because there's some big fanciful display that people can watch with their whole family, you know?
Yeah, I see. Would you say that subscriptions such as Netflix, Hulu, Peacock, some of the new ones, does this have an effect on anything you just talked about?
I think to a sense, because for one, we do know that, you know, like streaming services such as Netflix do exercise some type of control in what content is put out on their platforms. And so to a degree, yes, they could sort of censor certain subjects from being introduced in movies and whatnot. I know of like comedians, for example, there are certain comedians who are hesitant to put specials out on streaming services because the streaming service will tell them to edit jokes and whatnot.
Oh, like I think Dave Chappelle. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So we're going to see that same phenomenon happen with movies, and so I think it does have an effect. The sort of the evolution of streaming services and what movies are released and whatnot.
Do you think that hinders creativity? Much better movies could be made right now in this day and age, but they are not being made because of the lack of control?
Yeah, I think 100%. For one, the directors and the screenplay writers and whatnot, these are the real artists. And if you allow them to create without any restrictions, well, obviously you're going to get their best work. You know, I think what you're seeing with movies like The Matrix, Eyes Wide Shut, Fight Club, all being released within the same year when the music industry or the movie industry was at this crux of the perfect amount of like artistic freedom while also still being like a machine that can distribute the movies effectively. You see some of the best works of all time versus nowadays, you are sort of restricting an artist from doing their best work if you're having such control over, you know, how a movie is made, what subjects are being talked about in certain movies and what. Yeah.
Do you think that specific movies that I've seen you break down, like for instance, The Joker, we just talked about American Psycho, movies like that, there's always a strong emphasis on mental health. Do you think that a lot of people are connecting to these movies because the rise in mental health concerns nowadays? Do you think that's probably a reason why a lot of people are connecting to these movies now?
Yeah, I think 100%. And I think with The Joker specifically is a great example of this, because we talk about how like movies nowadays can't really be made in the same way that movies in the past were.
Sure.
I think the Joker movie is an exception to that rule. The Joker movie was released in 2019. And funny enough, that movie, the director has talked about, it's very much an homage to movies like Taxi Driver and these movies that were sort of up the same vein of like Fight Club and American Psycho. They feature disillusioned men in society trying to figure things out in a very blanket statement. But yes, what you're, I think, seeing in the rise of sort of mental health concerns is that these movies are vividly, in a very real way, depicting the dynamics of the sort of mental health crisis that we're seeing more and more people fall into. And I think that a lot of the attention in sort of mental health awareness is there's a lot of like self-help books. There's a lot of self-help like shows and podcasts and
Right.
whatnot, which are great.
Yeah, sure.
But the power that I think a movie has is that it has the story element of it. You sort of have this external character and you're seeing their story develop while at the same time you're seeing certain sort of like similarities in the mental health conundrums they deal with, or you're seeing similarities in just the general things they struggle with that you can relate to. And I think that has a very powerful effect on people that isn't necessarily touched on through another medium of communication.
Yeah, especially since, for example, watching, self-help books, podcasts, you see those people behind the authors or the podcasters that are talking about mental health. They are actual people that develop over time, and they may act or say or do something that turns people off towards them and they stop following them. But the thing about a movie is it's someone playing a character. So it's someone that you can always relate to even 20 years from now, because that movie ends within that, 3 hours, and then the character is done. So it's something that you can always relate to, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, 100%. I think the ability to relate to an external character.
That's not going to change because it's a movie.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have quite an insight, like I was saying before, into Nietzsche, Freud, some people like this. Is this something you've always had an interest in these thinkers and philosophers? How did you get your interest in this with these people?
Yeah. So when I was in high school, I was really into high school debate. I was 14 years old when I first kind of got into it.
Yeah.
And in the sort of high school debate circuit that I was involved in, there was very much, that's when I was just introduced to the whole world of like Western philosophy. Growing up culturally, I've had like a kind of like cultural upbringing with like Eastern philosophy concepts and whatnot. But people like Nietzsche and Freud and Dostoevsky, it was through when I was in high school debate that I just learned of the names of these people and then was exposed to like the surface level understanding of their philosophies. And out of all my time in high school, I really looked to that as sort of the knowledge that I took the most interest in and generally just stuck with me. And the reason why is because, as I've told you, I've always had an interest in art, like movies and music, which was never the stable path forward. Right. And so being someone who's interested in being an artist, you have this weird crossroads that you're in when you're surrounded by everyone telling you like, oh, be a data scientist and whatnot. You kind of feel like you're existing in this world that isn't necessarily the truth. You know that you can pursue a life being an artist and whatnot, but everyone is telling you like, oh no, that's not pragmatic. It's not realistic. Be a data scientist.
Sure.
The reason I bring that up is because I really was drawn to sort of some of these Western philosophers like Nietzsche or Dostoevsky talking about one, they have some great quotes talking about like the value of art into just like really breathing life into yourself. Art has that ability. But the other thing is I'm really drawn by their sort of writings on sort of individual development, individuals seeking the sort of will to power to sort of like actualize their own life, actualize their own interests in life, and not sort of conform to the standards of the herd. These are sort of some of the major topics that like Nietzsche, Dostoevsky really like hammer home in their writings. And that always interested me. I was always taking a keen interest in understanding like why is it that there are sort of certain standards that people adhere to in terms of like, oh, you have to be doctor, lawyer, engineer,
Right.
which was put upon me. And can you sort of break from that mold? Because we see people in society who don't fit the mold and successful. And so like how I've always asked myself, like, how is that possible for them? Why can he be a musician and I have to be a data scientist or something?
No, it absolutely makes sense. And the image of success is definitely changing because the rise of, influencer culture and the rise of social media has definitely given a new image to success. Fortunately or unfortunately, I think in some ways it is good because you have it. So how do I say this correctly? Social media has given people the biggest individual land grab that they could, they could have. You could start a business and get exposure through social media. But the downside of it is, I would say, the mental health effects of social media and all those things, because it's a constant comparison between you and the person next to you. And they always seem like they're doing amazing in life, but you're only seeing that little 5-second snippet.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
don't see you see them with their beautiful, girlfriend, their handsome boyfriend or whatever, but you don't see the
You don't see
hours
you
of
don't see
arguing
reality.
and you don't see the reality behind it,
Yeah.
or like their successful business, but you don't see how much they had to sacrifice. You just see the very final product.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me more about where do you see Synopsis videos, your channel going? What do you want to do with this channel? Where do you see it going?
Yeah.
And
So
what do you think differentiates you from other channels?
right now, the channel has been more about just like, why is this character you? Why do you relate to this character? I think moving forward, it's going to be how has modernity turned into some reality show? Let's use the Truman Show as an example, but then let's also kind of talk about the works of different philosophers as we do on the show to analyze this concept of reality has become a reality TV show. So that's kind of moving forward how the videos are going to change. Plus we got a proper editor now, which always helps.
Oh, I love that. I saw actually in one of your videos, you talking about Christopher Nolan and just the genius of Christopher Nolan. Is that your favorite director or one of them? Or
Yeah, Christopher Nolan is my favorite director. He's definitely number one.
yeah,
I'm particularly drawn to Christopher Nolan because he's a writer director. So not only does he obviously direct amazing movies, he writes the story. And what's funny is that I kind of moving to LA, I realized that it's a lot more rare than I thought. I remember when I was just like growing up in Texas, I thought, oh, the director is the one that writes the movie. But I realized like a lot of these superstar directors, they don't write the story to their movies.
right.
Christopher Nolan obviously is one of kind of, when you think of writer director, I think he's one of the first ones you think about. And it's particularly his story writing that I think I'm really inspired by.
Christopher Nolan has been in the game for a very long time. Is there anyone that's more up and coming you look up to, or not really?
It's a very good question.
Because I mean, I don't want to assume, but I think we both would agree that the qualities of movies have really decreased over the years. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, in certain ways.
In certain ways, yeah.
Yeah, I think that the way that movies necessarily have gotten better is the sense that I think the visual landscapes of movies.
Oh, that's gotten a lot better.
Yeah, just because like technology wise now you can the possibilities are endless. I think in terms of story, which is what primarily I'm interested in with movies, 100%. Like I haven't seen a movie come out in a long time where the story has really sort of like captured me. I don't know. When I think of like all my favorite movies, like none of them have really. I don't think any of them are at least like 10 years or younger. They've all been in the past.
Right.
And that's just because maybe for one that I'm very interested in like great stories over the visual cinematography. But generally, I mean, this is a kind of a consensus that you see amongst many people that movies just kind of aren't the same as they were in the past.
Yeah. It is. I would honestly agree that it is a consensus because I hear that a lot from a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'll just put it that way.
There are great directors out there. Like Greta Gerwig's really good. Taika Waititi is really good. But yeah, for me personally, like the movies of the past are what do it for me, you know?
Yeah. Christopher Nolan has done a lot of different type of work, a lot of different type of genres. Is there a specific, I mean, it might be a little bit of a hard question because he's done so many different genres and types of work, but is there a specific movie or set of movies you like the most out of all his work?
Yeah, that's
a tough question, but
yeah. I think the Dark Knight is my favorite Christopher Nolan movie. I think, and that's my favorite movie of all time. I think the Joker, I think Heath Ledger's performance of the Joker,
amazing.
Yeah, I think it's the greatest on-screen performance ever. It's so good. It is ridiculously good.
It never gets old either.
Yeah, it never gets
No,
old.
never gets old.
One
It's
thing
timeless.
that I learned recently is that Timothy, I'm going to say his name wrong, Timothy Chalamet, he started acting because of that role.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, it was that role that got him to start acting.
Wow.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a lot of Timothy Chalamet's, I don't hope I'm not mispronouncing it, his work, but I haven't seen a role that he played that's like that. Or
Yeah.
has he? I don't know if he has.
He hasn't, but I think that maybe speaks to like the genius of the role, which is that
No one can do it.
yeah,
Right,
it's
right,
like,
right.
it's just so out there.
Yeah.
Like, Heath Ledger invented, obviously, like, yeah, Christopher Nolan wrote the script,
Sure.
but Heath Ledger invented this character, and he invented a character that is just so out of the realm of what we have seen as a human. His character is obviously a human being, but he's almost like this like mythical. The Joker is like not.
And it's like the amount of characters and the genre switching. It's like go from Brokeback Mountain to The Dark Knight. It's like
Yeah.
two completely different characters.
Yeah.
How do you just switch like that? Very artistic guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Dark Knight is my favorite. Yeah.
If he was still around, man, he would have been killed.
I know.
Unfortunately, he did pass away, but
Yeah.
he was great while we had him. But
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I see. So what advice would you give to, I could ask this a couple of different ways. So I just want to benefit somebody that's watching this. What advice would you give to someone that wants to start a YouTube channel in movie critiquing? That's a separate question. And then this is for someone that's younger, high school student. He or she wants to get into, cinematography. They want to get into directing. They want to get into anything with movie making. What advice would you give them? What would you say to them?
Yeah. I'd say for people who are interested in creating a YouTube channel, kind of similar to ours or about like movie reviews and whatnot,
Sure.
my bit of advice to them is see how you can speak to people on a deep level. I know that might sound a little bit surface level, but I'll kind of qualify that statement by saying when people give like movie reviews or movie analysis, what I see happen a lot is they give their own personal opinion on a movie, or they sort of just give a summary of what the movie is. But I think it's important to ask yourself if a movie has sort of like struck a big cultural
Chord.
Yeah, very good. Like a big cultural chord. Ask yourself, why is that the case? Because there are thousands and millions of other people asking themselves that question as well. Like, oh, I saw The Dark Knight, that movie. There's something about the Joker character that I just can't.
It hits you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ask yourself, why is that the case? And the answer to that question, I think, is the source for your next video. Because if you can provide people an explanation to a feeling that they have but can't intellectualize or rationalize, that's where you can provide someone insight into their own mind or their own selves, which is personally what I think we try to do with Synopsis. Now, for people interested in getting into directing or producing a movie or editing, as someone who obviously like my artistic explorations have been more in the world of music,
Sure.
although I have started to like direct my own videos for my music. I think that the number one thing is to really identify what your interests are. Who are the directors that inspire you? Who are the actors that inspire you? What are the types of stories that inspire you? Because when you sort of embark on the journey of trying to be an artist, I think it's very easy to get swayed from that. People will tell you, you need to direct in this style because this is what has worked for me in the past, or this is what has worked for the people that has influenced me. Whereas you need to be steadfast in who has inspired you, what has inspired you, because that is the DNA to who you will be as a director or as an actor or as an editor.
Yeah. And would you recommend that person really pursues their education in that field, or would you recommend kind of what you did, get something, have a safety net, what would you recommend?
So I can't actually give a proper recommendation on this because it's different from person to person.
Sure.
I have met extremely successful people in the music industry and the movie industry who told me, you don't give yourself a plan B, just go straight ahead, plan A. And I've also met people who said, I had a plan B so that I could really shoot for the stars. It's different for every person. I think the answer to this, though, is do whatever allows you to make the best art. So for me personally, having a plan B really helps because I don't have the financial burdens associated with day-to-day life. If I'm working like a pretty solid job that also is like flexible, I have a lot of flexibility to create my art, you know? And I think the notion that you have to spend all day, every day working on your art is one like just not pragmatic because like you have to pay your bills at a certain point in time.
Sure.
And that's hard to do when you're just starting off as an artist. But the other thing that it's done is it's given me a roof over my head. I don't have to worry about eating, and like just keeping up with the basic necessities of life. That's just not a pressure that I feel. And because of that, I'm able to solely focus on creative acts, you know, being an artist and whatnot. I know so many people who are so inundated with the stress of day-to-day life that they can't actually set aside time for their own art, and for exploring their own artistic interests. Now, there are the other people who they're just like, you know what, I'm going to get a job as like a directing assistant or whatnot, or a production assistant.
Sure.
I'll deal with the little money that I make, but at least I'll be surrounded by the movie set in my day-to-day life. And then when I'm not working on those sets, I will just continue to do my art. And that's what works for them. So whatever, individuals know themselves better than I know them. Whatever they can come to surmise is the best for them is what, yeah.
Beautifully answered. You couldn't have answered that better.
Thank you.
Well, man, I want to, again, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insights with us. I look forward to watching even more of your content because I love watching your content.
Thanks, man.
And I wish you the best of luck. And I have no doubt that you're going to get whatever it is you want because you put in a level of work with the way that you analyze these movies that I have not seen in a long time. And believe me, I've watched a lot of I've watched a lot of movie critiquing channels. So
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
yeah, of course.